Hey everyone! In today's video, I want to review one of the recent big books that I just finished, which is this one, which you can obviously tell is Legends by Robert Silverberg. It's edited by Silverberg and it contains 11 short stories, all by very well-known fantasy authors. I've read a few of the big name fantasy series like Song of Ice and Fire, Wheel of Time, which I've read 8 out of 14 books, Lord of the Rings, but I haven't read very many others. So this was a really great way for me to get introduced to a lot of other imaginary worlds. Of this collection, I had only read works by 3 of the authors before, and that's Stephen King, George R.R. Martin, and Robert Jordan. And only 2 of those I had read the series that the short story in here was actually meant to be a companion to. This compilation has only 2 stories by female authors, and I honestly did not look into what races the authors were because I'm pretty sure they're all, if not mostly, white. Several of the stories by the male authors had female main characters, and of course in fantasy there are often lots of different races involved, so it wasn't completely white, but essentially. So if you aren't really into reading lots of white people fantasy, maybe skip this one. But aside from that, I actually really enjoyed reading this. I liked that I only had to stick to that fantasy world for one story and then I could move on. So if I didn't like it, I could look forward to whatever was coming next. And if I did like it, it would turn me on to finding more by that author. So I'm actually just going to go through each story and give you my overview of what I thought about it, and I won't really go into the specific details of each one because that would take way too long, and I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with these series or fantasy worlds already. The first one in the book is The Dark Tower by Stephen King, and the short story is called The Little Sisters of Illyria. And this was only the second thing that I've ever written by Stephen King. The only other thing was The Stand, so I'm not very familiar with the Dark Tower series, but when I was reading the description it included about the series in general, it did intrigue me, so I've added the first Dark Tower book to my read list. And I don't know if I would fully commit to the whole series, but I think I'll at least try it out at some point. So this specific short story I did enjoy. It was pretty different from anything else that I've read, and I wouldn't really consider it my favorite kind of fantasy, but it was definitely interesting. The second book was from the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, and the short story is The Sea and Little Fishes. And the short story follows Granny Weatherwax, who is one of the witches in the Discworld series, and this is the first thing I've ever read by Terry Pratchett. And I would say, hands down, this was my favorite story out of the whole book. I absolutely loved it. I loved the writing and just his very sharp wit, and I just love how he can reveal so much about a world with just one sentence, and it kind of hits you what else that sentence implies and describes about the world without going into overly descriptive, wordy sentences. And it was really funny, and I have realized lately I don't really read a lot of funny books, so I think this might be a good place for me to start. I own an ebook copy of The Color of Magic, which was on sale shortly after Terry Pratchett died, and that is the first book in the Discworld series, and I have since acquired a paperback copy of Equal Rights, which is the first book in the cycle, I think it's called, of books about Granny Weatherwax and that part of the Discworld universe. And I haven't read Good Omens, which he co-wrote with Neil Gaiman, but I own that as an ebook as well, so I definitely look forward to reading that one, which I've heard is coming out as a TV series. So the short story I read after that one was from The Sword of Truth by Terry Goodkind, and it's called Debt of Bones. And I've never read anything by Terry Goodkind. I don't really plan to, and after reading Terry Pratchett's short story, this one was very overly descriptive and just took ages to explain everything and describe the world, and with Terry Pratchett's world, it just exists. It's there and it happens, and you see it happen and you understand it. But in the Debt of Bones story, there was just a lot of explaining and adjectives and descriptive words, and I didn't really enjoy that one. But it was okay overall. The next story was from Tales of Alvin Maker by Orson Scott Card, and this one is called The Grinning Man. And I have read a book by Orson Scott Card, which was Ender's Game. So I guess I kind of forgot about that one. And I liked Ender's Game, and Alvin Maker is a very different kind of setup. And I don't really plan to read anything else by Orson Scott Card, so I'll just take the short story for what it is on its own, and it was interesting, it was alright, I enjoyed it, and that's about it. The next book is by Robert Silverberg, who picked out these short stories, and it's from the Madripoor series, and it's called The Seventh Shrine. This one was actually a lot more sci-fi than fantasy, I felt, but it was definitely kind of a combination. But it involved almost more of a mystery and crime scene procedural kind of story. So I thought that was interesting and a good example of how different fantasy series can be from each other. And even though it's in a fantasy kind of world, it can really be more like a mystery and investigation kind of thing. So I enjoyed this one. I don't really plan to read anything else by Robert Silverberg, but I enjoyed it for its own thing. The next short story is from Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and this one is called Dragonfly. And I liked this one. I thought it was really interesting because it's about a girl who wants to enter the kind of wizardry industry, which traditionally in this world is made up of only men. So it was really interesting to see how she kind of invaded that space and how Le Guin played with female and male stereotypes in this book. And I would like to read more by her, most definitely. The next book is from the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn series, I believe, and that's by Tad Williams, and this one is called The Burning Man. And it took me a while to remember what this one was, but now I recall that it kind of took me a while to get into, and I didn't really enjoy the setup of this one because the whole short story is all just memory. It's someone telling you their memory, so nothing is happening in the current narrative. And that was really confusing at first because it took me a while to figure that out. And as I finally got into it, it was interesting and I liked the world setup, but it just kind of took a while for me to get through. The next book was from A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, and it's the first short story from the Dunk and Egg series of short stories. And this one is called The Hedge Knight. So it introduces a knight nicknamed Dunk and a little boy named Egg, who turns out to be someone with a much more prominent role in the history of this world. It was really interesting to read, and it was the first one that I kind of had a direct connection to, where I was very familiar with that world and what was going on. So I liked that one, and I will definitely be reading the rest of the Dunk and Egg short stories at some point. The book, or I keep saying book, but I mean short story. The short story after that was from The World of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, and it's called Runner of Pern, and she writes a lot of dragon kind of fantasy books. And I hadn't read anything by her, but I have marked the first Pern book as to read on Goodreads prior to reading this book. I did, for the most part, enjoy Runner of Pern, and I enjoyed the writing and the setup of the world, and it was pretty intriguing. But there were some issues I had with very stereotypical female things, such as the main character keeps getting complimented on how pretty she is, and there are just some kind of sexist compliments that people give her. And then there's a moment where she is trying on a dress and it fits her beautifully, except for the fact that her chest is too small, so she has to stuff the dress, and then she looks like completely amazing, and this boy falls for her. And it's just like, does that really have to happen in a fantasy world? Does that really have to matter? So I don't know if that kind of thing comes up in the rest of her writing. If you know, definitely let me know, and maybe I'll try to watch out for that if I do read her books in the future. But aside from that, I did enjoy this one. The second to last book in the series was The Rift War Saga by Raymond E. Feist, and this short story is called The Wood Boy. And this one was a little confusing and difficult for me to get into because it starts with one scene and then it goes back in time to tell the rest of the story and catches up to the very first scene. And by this time, I was kind of ready to be finished with the book and just wanted to get through this one so I could get to the last story. So when I did finish this one, I kind of went back to the beginning and reread the first scene so I could comprehend what I had missed the first time. And it was fine. I enjoyed it. It didn't really intrigue me enough to want to read more by him. And it was also very short. It was only about 30 pages. And finally, the last one was from the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, and this one is called New Spring, which is a pretty well-known story if you are a fan of the Wheel of Time series. But I hadn't read it yet, and I'm glad that I did, and this one I kind of felt even more of a direct connection to than I did with the Song of Ice and Fire story, because it includes two characters that you are very familiar with directly if you have read the series of Wheel of Time. So it was really interesting to get to see this moment that happens before the series with characters you know very well and characters that I really like from the series a lot. This one was a bit longer, but since I was so familiar with the world and the way things worked, I did enjoy it, and I almost got through the story without noticing the mentions of skirt smoothing. The first time one popped up, I was like, oh, that's what feels different about this short story. There hasn't been any braid tugging or skirt smoothing yet. But alas, there were a few mentions of it in the second half of the story. This is also the only story I have no idea what people would think of if they haven't read the main series, because there's a lot to this world and the setup of what the heck is going on. So I would feel that if someone hadn't read the Wheel of Time series first, they wouldn't really like this one as much because they'd have no idea what was going on, who was who, and what was happening between the characters. So even though I don't really plan on reading more works by the majority of these authors, I did really enjoy the experience as a whole. And I actually have volume 2 of Legend, which I think has a few more females. I think it has 3 instead of 2. And that one is a little bit shorter, so I think the stories are individually a little bit shorter on average than in volume 1. So if you've read any of the main series associated with these short stories that I haven't read and you think I would like them, definitely let me know. A lot of them have short stories in volume 2 as well, so I'll get a little bit more of a taste from them there. This is, of course, one of the books I've been reading as part of my Big Books in 2017 plan, and I got it from a bookstore that I volunteered at, where I got store credit in exchange for volunteering. So I got this book for free, so I didn't pay any money for it, and I am happy to get it off of my shelf and on its way somewhere else, and I'm still grateful for the time that I spent with it. So if you have any questions about this book, let me know down below as well, and thank you as always for watching. Bye.